Okay, we're live. I'm going to call the meeting to order. And today we have a bill on electric cooperatives and property tax exemption for broadband, and Maria and Abby are here. And this, I believe, is a bill that relates to the Washington Electric request for tax exemption if they put up broadband. And I'm hoping that as much as I'd like to just move forward on Washington Electric, since a large part of their territory is in my territory, I want to make sure that we understand how poles and wires are taxed and any other implications that may come out of this action. I don't want us to find out there was an oops, we never thought of that 3 weeks, 6 weeks down the road. So just trying to get a handle on that. So Maria and Abby, floor is yours. I've got Maria first, but I don't know how that works.
Good afternoon, Maria Royal with Legislative Counsel. Yes, I think that works if I go first. I can walk through the bill, kind of the purpose of the bill. Abby's available to talk in greater detail about some of the tax provisions and implications in terms of tax analysis. And then the other thing that I was asked to do, just so you know what's ahead, is after we're done with that, kind of move on to a broader discussion about regulation of broadband, state regulation of broadband generally. So that is a much broader conversation. So we'll get to that once you've finished reviewing S64. And I'm glad Senator Bray is here because he can weigh in as the sponsor of the bill in terms of his intent. And I see Senator McDonald is raising a hand.
Madam Chair, are we going to start out with understanding how it's taxed now before we hear about the bill?
I think we're going to walk through the bill and then we'll hear about the tax. Oh,
whatever makes sense to you. Whatever makes sense to you.
If you'd like to hear it first, we can do that. So Abby, can you tell us how is broadband taxed at the moment?
Great. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. So currently we're talking about non-homestead property. So you're looking at electric utilities and structures, machinery, cables, poles, lines, and fixtures. So when we talk about broadband infrastructure, there isn't a specific tax provision targeting that infrastructure. I'm going to just walk through what current statute says and how different entities are treated. First of all, there is a distinction between those entities that are municipal entities and non-municipal entities. So the electric utility poles, lines, and fixtures owned by non-municipal entities, utilities are taxed at their appraisal value. Those are set in the grand list as real estate. When it's a municipal corporation that owns these structures, that is not taxable. So a CUD, for example, when they're within their own jurisdiction or one of their member jurisdictions, that's not taxable. However, if that municipal entity owns any property outside of its jurisdiction, that is taxable. So just pause there and make sure that's sinking in.
Okay, I think we got that.
Okay. So that's the basic framework. And then we can talk about how it's being changed under the bill. I don't know if you want me to walk through it from the property tax side first. Oh, sorry, there are some questions.
Okay, we got a question. Senator Pearson.
Abby.
And then Senator Sorokin. Okay.
Thank you. Just have we ever had a situation, or maybe you could tell us what the law would dictate when a non-tax entity sells taxed entity sells something to a business entity? I assume those assets then start to get taxed. Is that correct?
That would be correct. So the sale would, once it switches to a non-municipal entity, then their ownership, it would be when they're listed on the grand list. So that would switch to taxable. Yes,
Thank you.
that answers the question.
Senator Sirotkin.
So let me start off by saying that that explanation was so much easier than remote workers. I've got to say. Anyhow, I think I've raised this like 3 or 4 times. And it's my fault that I don't follow through. And I know Maria has gotten me some information, but polls are in our discussion here. And I keep thinking back to Tom Cvet's memo where he specifically highlighted the precipitous drop in tax collections on polls. And why is that? Does it get valued when they construct a pole and they get 30-year depreciation and that becomes the value for, I don't think that's the value for real estate appraisal. And I know these poles seem to be in high demand in terms of their rental value. Why has the value of poles gone down that we're losing millions of dollars each year to the education fund?
Yeah, I haven't been really apprised of that situation. Can I defer to Maria if she has worked on that issue?
Well, a little bit. It's been a while. I think Senator Sirotkin, when this came up, I remember that Tom Cvet's report. I think it mostly had to do with the depreciation that a lot of these poles have been around for a very long time. And there's a set schedule of depreciation. I think there's a floor, but that basically they've been almost fully depreciated at this time. And so unless you kind of revalue or come up with a different way of valuing the property, I'm not sure that under the current statute, there's going to be much change there. And I think as Abby mentioned, though, the telephone personal property tax, I believe from the Department of Taxes perspective, does not apply to broadband. So it's not really clear who's paying the state tax and who's not paying. So I think there's a little bit of ambiguity there also.
Well, I think Senator Brock may know this better than I do. I think there's there are exemptions for turning over your house, but eventually there could be some tax on the sale of a home. But you look at the depreciated value in terms of calculating that tax on transferring the home, but that doesn't affect the appraised value for property tax purposes. So I don't understand why a pole, even though the company's taking depreciation, why the town has to go along with that depreciation in terms of appraising it. The pole itself, I mean, I don't know a lot about this, but it seems like if you can sell your pole rights to somebody else, it's a valuable business. It's a valuable piece of property. And why isn't it valued at its current value? I don't know. I mean, I think we need to look into it because I think Tom
It sounds like a topic unto itself. Can I assume if you put up a new pole that then you have to start depreciation all over again?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
could perhaps the change in federal law, which allows the depreciation of some items in a single year, have precipitated some of this?
Okay, something to look into.
I guess I would say,
So can we get an answer, if not today, tomorrow or the next day?
well, yeah, sure, but
Yep.
it may be relevant to this bill, if for nothing else, as a related amendment So that's why I'd like.
Okay, I would suggest that we all read the tax structure committee study, because the one thing in the income tax they recommended was that we do away with the tax on telephone poles.
I know
I
that,
believe I remember that correctly.
that might be
So
the-
they should have some information and documentation in that study. It might be a good place to start. Okay. But this one, this is all in relation to a cooperative's request that if they string broadband on their pole, or they put up new poles to string broadband on, that their electric payers not have to pay a tax on a pole that is bringing broadband service. And I believe we can't tax broadband, can we?
That's a broader discussion.
Okay.
That's a much broader, and we will cover that. Maybe let's not jump right there
No,
yet. And at
Senator-
any point, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Senator Hardy has a question.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Abby, just a clarification. Your explanation was clear, but I wanted to make sure I understood it. So municipalities are not, they don't tax themselves unless the things they own are outside their jurisdiction. That makes sense.
Right.
Private companies and these cooperatives are taxed. What did you say about the communication unions districts? Are they taxed or not?
No.
They're not when they're operating within their jurisdiction. So their member jurisdiction is a CUD is considered a municipality under state statute.
I see. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, this is personal property. Do the poles and wires inside the town of Northfield Electric, do they pay state school tax? Or are they exempt and are exempt from the local property tax? Or do they pay no tax on their poles and wires?
Is it a municipal?
Yes, Northfield is a municipal utility.
Okay.
We can
So
research.
that would have sorry. So I was thinking ahead as to how they would be treated under the bill, but you're asking under current law.
Under current law.
So no, so they would not be taxed under either.
Okay,
It
So
applies
they
to both
are
local and
tax
education.
exempt. Okay, as long as they are within their own municipality. All right. Senator Bray.
One quick question on this is there any difference between infrastructure hung on a pole and the pole itself in terms of tax liability? So for instance, we were getting at a little bit, for instance, well, let me pause there and explain the part B. I'll just stop.
So is it the pole taxed, or is the wire hung on the pole taxed?
So under current statute, it lists the different portions of the infrastructure. So under in Title 32, it's electric utility poles, lines, and fixtures owned by non-municipal utilities that are taxed. So it
Okay,
lists
lines are taxed.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, great. And so the just because we're entering into the weedy territory, the problem, as I heard it, was that we were trying to build up broadband, and is there a way to do it more inexpensively? And so if the broadband were strung on poles that the cooperative, for instance, already owned, there would be no change in the pole itself, but you would have new taxable infrastructure, theoretically, possibly taxable infrastructure on the pole. And this would be a clarification. No, we're not applying tax to it with the goal of bringing down their costs, which could be passed along to the ISPs that they ultimately lease to. My understanding from the WEC discussion was that they don't anticipate adding any new poles. It would be new cable on existing poles, but maybe there's some instances where there's more to it than that.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was a combination, but because they were talking about going outside their territory. So I think the question is, and this gets into the power that the state has, do we tax, we tax electric wires. I'm pretty sure we tax telephone wires. But do we tax broadband? Because broadband, we are not allowed in most instances to regulate broadband. And I know we've tried to tax VoIP with, I think, no success, which is voice over internet. So,
Well,
And can I add one wrinkle into that list? And that is just that this same fiber may be used for systems data acquisition and control by the utility. So it ends up becoming a utility function as well as the other things they could do with other fibers in the bundle.
so I'm maybe jumping a little bit ahead. Just to clarify, there is certainly a lot of ambiguity about the state's authority. However, if you had a state statute authorizing the collection of property taxes on broadband infrastructure, you could most likely collect that. So right now, the telephone personal property tax applies to telephone infrastructure, not broadband. That's just not how it was written. And I think the tax department has said that it's just not something that's really been on their radar. It's something they collect. Now, whether, I can't speak much more beyond that. So, so there is authority, there is the possibility of taxing the broadband infrastructure. Questions about taxing broadband service, not the infrastructure, that's a different matter. And that's where you've run into problems. That's why under the state's universal service fund, where you collect the universal service charge on your telephone bills, it's declining. The state would love to apply it to broadband service monthly subscriptions like they do for telephone bills, but that is prohibited under the Internet Tax Freedom Act. However, even though the FCC and the state has never specifically said or classified what VoIP is, the state is currently collecting the universal service charge on VoIP service. So, yeah. So I just wanted to kind of level set there. Lots of different things are relevant here. But I also didn't know if you wanted us to pull up the bill and kind of look at the language, or if you're familiar enough with it in concept and just want to kind of continue this discussion about the proposal. So what?
I think it might be good to walk through the bill.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, so Abby's actually going to.
Senator Pearson has a question.
I'm sorry to interrupt momentum, but when Comcast strings a line, we tax that under the property, on its property, right? Because it doesn't matter, other than a municipal, which is a public entity, we tax them in this whole zone. Doesn't matter what service they're offering, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I want to make sure we're all on the same page because that's been confusing. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yep.
Regarding the taxation of these various components ranging from poles to lines, are there the potential of different depreciation schedules that would apply to each?
That's a great question. I would need to do more research into that.
Because I think it could be important. In other words, the life of a pole is probably a lot different than the life of a fiber on it, which may be different than some other component that's attached to the top of the pole.
Okay, I will look into that for sure. Okay.
I would bet that's true. That's a good question, Randy, Senator Brock. I think they must have different depreciations. Yeah.
I'm sure the utilities could tell us very quickly. Okay, let's
Okay,
walk through the.
So
bill.
Abby, would you mind
Yes, I'll pull that. Just
Just
give me a
gonna-
moment.
pull up the bill? And I'll start, just so we're familiar with the concept, and then Abby can explain the various amendments in Title 32 that will actually effectuate this purpose. So as you can see, subdivision 19 of section 3802 is a provision in the tax code, the state's tax code, Title 32. And the actual language is that real and personal property except land owned by an electric cooperative, so yes, Washington Electric Cooperative or Vermont Electric Cooperative, those are the two electric cooperatives in the state, that comprises broadband infrastructure, including structures, machinery, lines, poles, wires, and fixtures. So this is a description of the property that would be exempt from taxation. I will just note that, one of the things that's come up in other committees, the House Energy and Technology Committee, looking at, similar concepts, is at some point, you may want to further define broadband infrastructure in terms of, do you want it specifically an exemption that's available for fiber and only fiber, or other types of, whether it's coaxial cable or DSL or wireless facilities? I'm merely flagging that as an issue of something that you might want to just further refine, what your intent is. So I think the rest, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while. Okay, so Abby can kind of explain these corollary provisions of the tax code.
Great. So then the next section 2 adds in a statutory purpose, because under Vermont statute, when a new tax expenditure is created, it's required to have a statutory purpose to be implemented and enforced. So the stated statutory purpose here of allowing the exemption for broadband infrastructure for electric cooperatives is to lower the cost of broadband deployment in unserved and underserved areas of Vermont. The next section 3 in Title 32, section 3602A, goes into this. Hold on. It changes some cross references in statute to make it clear that they don't. They're not impacted by any way with this new exemption that's added in 3802. So that's just cleaning up statute, and it's different references. This also makes it clear that because these electric cooperatives would otherwise be considered taxable, it says here that electric utility poles, lines, and fixtures owned by non-municipal entities are taxed at appraisal value. Here it says except as provided under the new exemption in subdivision 3802 19. And then the final section creates the effective date as of July 1st, 2021. And it states that this would apply to grand list going forward after that date. So I can stop screen sharing now unless there are other questions about the line.
That would be the grand list for the April. It's what, April 1st, 2022. The grand list
Exactly.
is set.
The following year. That's correct.
What I'm trying to understand is Washington Electric said they didn't want to have all their poles and wires exempted, just the broadband cable, or I thought any new poles they put up exclusively to run broadband, because that's what they're borrowing for. I don't, they've got their own line crews. The big cost would be additional poles. So but I want to make sure we aren't I don't want the League of Cities and Towns coming in screaming that we just took millions of dollars off their grand list by accident. So I want to make sure we've got this as limited as it needs to be. Senator Sirotkin.
I have the same question, Madam Chair. Can we go back to the first section of the bill on the screen? Because I think it does, the language does, the way I read it, it sweeps in everything of the cooperative as long as broadband is part of the property. Yeah, the definition here. It says all property, real and personal, that comprises broadband infrastructure. I don't know if that's clear enough to say that it's exclusively the broadband portion of the real and personal property.
Yeah, 'cause
Maybe if Legislative Council feels that it is, then I guess that answers the chair's question and my concern.
it sounded more than they were asking for.
It depends
And
on, I think.
Mary will have the co-op back in to talk to us about their taxing structure and what they are paying on now. And more specifically, I think now that have had a chance to work through some of this, what are they asking to have exempt? Because I remember them saying, we don't want to exempt anything that's existing. But we don't want our electric folks to have to pay property tax on broadband that is not an electric service that
The simplest question would be, if you had a pole that had broadband and telephone or electric on it, with this exemption, how would it be read as to what elements are taxed? And how do you do the evaluation of that?
Yeah, I think the request and what we've been talking about is just the cable, unless they had to string new poles to expand, because they were talking about they could borrow money at a lower rate than the CUDs. And they have poles in some of the CUD area that they could string it on. But they were, I thought, talking about stringing new poles and then leasing access on those poles exclusively for broadband. But because there are some places in Orange County that don't have electricity, but most of them do. So I saw Senator Bray, I think Senator McDonald, and then Senator Brock.
Short one, Madam Chair.
Senator.
It's vocabulary, Madam Chair.
Vocabulary. All right. God save you.
The discussion is about broadband from pole to pole to pole. There are 4 ways to get broadband involving poles, and we need to know the separate ways so we know what we are exempting. Wire, cable, fiber, and
Okay.
wireless.
That I already have on my list of questions for us is, what are we talking about? Is it all broadband or is it just fiber? Okay. Or are we going to exempt DSL, which gets us into telephones? Okay. Or wireless. All right. So then I saw Senator Bray and Senator Brock.
Thank you. So this is really a question to our drafters on this. The way I read that, it has a restrictive clause. There's no comma which. It's no comma at all and that. So as best I know, when I read that second part about broadband infrastructure applies to the phrase preceding it. And so it doesn't allow you to say that, you know, telephone infrastructure could somehow that could also lose its tax liability. But I'm just trying to make sure I'm reading it properly. I thought that it took care of Senator Sirotkin's concern that it could be interpreted overly broadly.
I think that's certainly the intent. But if there is any ambiguity whatsoever, there is no reason why, you know, we can't come up with language that is perfectly clear.
Yeah. Well,
I think our intent is not to exempt anything that is presently paying tax, but that any new infrastructure, and then it gets into, okay, they put up new infrastructure and then they string telephone wires or electric wires on that.
Well, right. So I suppose it could be maybe more explicit. And I'm learning in this committee, we refer to that as boots and suspenders. I'd always heard belt and suspenders, but lately I've been hearing boots and
It's got to be
suspenders.
Senator McDonald.
I don't know how that works with your boots and suspenders.
And just a clarification, if I may, and you know, I've worked on so many things. So and Abby, please remind me, I can't remember if in this version, does it apply to new construction only? Okay, so I think that is an issue to flag, is something for you to decide, because the way it's drafted now, it's not necessarily to new broadband infrastructure. Okay, so this could be existing broadband infrastructure. If the co-ops own any, or you know, obviously they have some communications infrastructure for their own purposes, but that's just something to flag to make sure it serves your purpose, your intent. Is it only
We'll
new
have them
infrastructure
back
going
in.
forward? Okay, so that's something.
Okay. Are we? Senator Hardy? No, Senator Brock, I think. Did I have you for a question next? Yep, and then Senator Hardy.
Well, you know, as we've discussed this and several other things here in this past week, I just wonder if this is a recognition by the committee that our tax code is not complicated enough. And so we therefore need to add something additional to it. We're talking about this tax expenditure report, the purpose for which is to simplify the tax code. And all we've been talking about is adding further exceptions, exemptions, workarounds, and so on. I just wonder, for example, why can't cooperatives, if there is going to be a continuation, and again, I know the tax expenditure report, the tax structure report suggests otherwise, that the co-op pass on their additional costs relating to taxes to whoever it is they lease those lines to, assuming that they're leasing them to someone. Why do we have to get involved in it at all? And also just bear in mind the fact that every time, and this is something I'm going to repeat constantly, every time we give a tax break to someone, we increase taxes for everybody else.
Okay.
Unless
And I
it's new.
think the passing along, we've got a little margin here that they can do it cheaper. And that if they have to pass that cost on to the co-ops, the CUDs, then it isn't cheaper for them to do it. But we'll get into that. Wait, I've got Senator Hardy, then Pearson, then Bray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just will weigh in and say, I think this definition that we have in here is too broad, and that it doesn't clearly specify what we're trying to exempt, or I don't know who's we at this point, because
You've been asked to exempt. I don't know that we've reached the point of saying we're trying.
Exactly, because my understanding is that they want to use existing poles to string this new broadband wire, so and fiber. And so those poles are already taxed, and I don't think the intention should be that we would not continue to tax them. And then my second question is just a question, I don't know, for Maria or Abby, about there's the Washington Electric Co-op, which is the one who came in and made the request to us. Who are the other ones? Because this is written to exempt them all. Is that correct? If they
Yes.
all decide to do this. So how many are we talking about?
There are two,
There are two.
Washington Electric and Vermont Electric
Okay.
Cooperative.
Okay, I'm trying to remember the map. The Washington one covers a lot of Washington County, but then also gets
And Orange County, yep, Central Vermont, and Vermont Electric Co-op is more Northeast Kingdom.
And Andrea
area.
Cohen is their director. She's been in on the VEPSA bill and will be back.
Yeah, okay. I just want to really make sure that we hear from municipalities and school districts, because that's an area of the state where they're always trying to actually increase their property values and in order to help with their tax rates. And I'm just concerned that they would lose the opportunity. So I want to hear from them before we decide how to move forward.
All right, I've got Senator, I think I had Senator no, now everybody just jumped around on my screen, so I've lost it. I've got Pearson, Bray, and Brock, I believe in that order. Don't let the screen jump anymore.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to Senator Brock. He said, why couldn't the co-op just pass it on to the customer or to the leasee? That's the point. The leasee is the CUD, and they don't pay property taxes because they're a municipality. And so if we want to take advantage of the low-cost financing that a co-op can use, basically it's a financing mechanism for the CUDs. And if we use the co-ops, it's unfortunate that absent a change of law, there's a 6% or there's a property tax implication. And so the way you phrase it, Senator Brock, is exactly, to my mind, the logic here is that the customer doesn't normally pay property taxes. And it's not, I typically agree totally that when we give somebody a tax break, everybody else pays the bill, but this is new. So we're not passing on costs, we're just foregoing potentially revenue, although in this case we probably wouldn't get the revenue because it wouldn't be built. So anyway, those are small points, but they matter, I think, at least as I understand, to the logic of this.
Senator Brock and then Bray, I think. Is Senator Brock, did you have another question or?
I did. I have two questions. One, just respond to Senator Pearson. I think he makes a good point regarding CUDs. And the question then would be, CUDs would not be potentially exclusively the only users of this facility. And the notion of crafting something that might exempt a non-tax-paying lessor, that might apply to those things being leased to CUDs, assuming they continue to lease it. But for non-CUDs, again, I think my logic regarding taxation would apply. The second question, though, that I had was, we talked about things like fiber lines being used for multiple purposes, some of which would be for this and some of which might be for entirely different purposes, all within the same bundle. How would we deal with that? And it's just a question that I don't think is addressed in the bill. I want to think through.
And I'm assuming that somebody from Washington Electric is probably watching this live feed, but we will definitely have them in and make it so they can see it and respond to a lot of these questions. So it's clearer in our mind exactly what they're asking for. And that would be helpful. Senator Bray.
Senator Pearson has said very well exactly what I was going to bring up, so I'm going to say pass and thank you.
Okay. Maria, I think we've been through the bill, right?
Yes.
And we have a lot of questions.
Yes.
All right. You had more prepared for us on,
Yes.
There's questions about what happens if we invest money to string broadband, and then those lines get sold to someone else. Perhaps a CUD says, we just can't do this anymore, and they sell their whole system to a for-profit provider. What?
That's a really good question. I didn't think you were going to go there.
Okay.
But no, and that's something that certainly that's a policy question you can address. I mean, I know that in general corporations law, when a nonprofit becomes a for-profit, there's a whole analysis and accounting that happens. So I think you're describing something similar. So if we're going to give, yep.
When we invested money in it's not the Kern-Hatton School, but it was the school for the deaf in Brattleboro. We invested a substantial amount of bonded money in that school, and part of the contract was if it ever is sold, the state would recoup, I think, its investment. It may have been a portion of its investment, but that we protected ourselves because we were investing in what was a private entity.
Mm-hmm.
It was providing the only such service in the state. But this, to me, seems similar. And I think the question is, how do we protect that investment? And but right now any kind of significant public investment in broadband is pretty much coming about now. I don't know that we protected ourselves before when we got money, but Senator Pearson.
Madam Chair, there's a difference to appropriating money that we're investing in this case, waiving property tax, but
no, we're not. We're talking about there's other issues with systems that are being built, and there's rumors that they might be going to be sold the day they're completed. This is not this Washington Electric or this bill. This is a further discussion that I've been trying to get us to focus on, which is now that there's a potential for putting a lot of public money into private enterprises. What powers? There's also been complaints that we don't demand open access. Can we demand open access? What can we do? And to regulate broadband. Now, we did pass a kind of universal access law, and as far as I know, at the Attorney General's request, that was put on hold pending court cases, and I've never heard it came out. Maybe Senator Sirotkin knows more than I do, but I think it's still sitting there. But that was 5 years ago, 4 years
net
ago.
neutrality laws that would.
Yes.
Yep. So that actually, yes, that was specific to government contracts,
right,
for internet service. In order to get a government contract, an ISP needed to certify that they would comply with net neutrality rules. That the Attorney General and the plaintiffs agreed to hold litigation until the outcome of what's called the Mozilla case, which was the challenge to, I'm sorry, gosh, there have been so many cases going on right now. Yeah, challenge to the Mozilla case, pending the outcome there, to the extent that it might influence what the courts would hold in Vermont. That case the federal case has concluded. But I believe the Attorney General this past fall and the plaintiffs agreed again that they would not go forward with the state litigation pending the outcome of a case now in California, because the state of California had enacted a law much broader than your law in Vermont, which basically applied net neutrality rules broadly to all providers in California. So that case, which had been put on hold, waiting for the outcome of the Mozilla case, has now been reinitiated. And everyone's eyes are kind of turned there to see what's going to happen. And recently, I don't know if you heard in the news, the Department of Justice has withdrew from that case. However, the litigation will continue because there are private parties involved there. So
Yeah.
a lot happening. And just let me know what would be helpful. I'm not sure your appetite now to kind of get like an overview of some of the considerations with respect to state regulation of broadband. Broadly speaking, you know, I have a presentation that we can just kind of quickly go through and might, you know, be a kind of level set and provide you a context, or maybe save that for another day. And really, what would be helpful to you?
What would you like, committee?
We got as far as we can on understanding the proposal for Washington Electric, or can we wrap that up?
I think we're going to wait for them to come in to clarify exactly what they're asking us to do. Then I think what Maria's going to set us up with is the bigger picture of what the law presently allows us to do. And some of this came out of the, you know, the federal changes on net neutrality. There's a new administration and we could see further federal changes. But I don't know that that's in the offing right now. So I've got Senator Hardy and then Senator Sirotkin.
Yeah, I was just wondering if JFO is going to come in and talk to us about the bill, and if there's been any kind of, I'd like to understand the fiscal impact of this and what they've
Yeah,
done.
and I think before we do that, we need to find out exactly what we're exempting or what they're asking. And then we'll ask the League of Cities and Towns and we'll ask JFO. But if it's just new poles, or is it old poles, or is it just wires? And where we go. Senator Sirotkin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You asked what the committee's druthers were on what Maria should present now. My only response is it's almost 2:30 on a Friday afternoon, and we still have the riveting issue of unemployment insurance to talk about.
Just a tax privacy thing. I say 3:30. We've got an hour to get people out, and I do that with the understanding that as we get closer to crossover, we may well be working it into 6:30. We've been known to go fairly as late as 10 on some of those days. So just remember that when I start working you really hard and the bills start coming over. Yeah. So Maria, can you give us something in like 15 minutes? And then Faith, did we tell the tax commissioner a time?
We told him 3 o'clock, but I can try to get him earlier if you want.
Okay, no, 3 o'clock was the time I was thinking. So Maria, if you can do something, maybe we can.
Okay.
In that amount of time.
Yes.
Senator Bray has a question. I'm sorry. Well, I'm not used to looking for yellow hands.
Yeah, I try them only in this committee, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. As we move on, so there's a lot of great questions here. Of course, I want to like all of you, to get clarity. I just worry that we might get so caught up in worrying about foregone tax revenue that we might not help this project go, and then no project goes there. And back to the territory thing, why are we talking about the two co-ops? Because no companies will go to these locations. Only the co-ops were building out into this less than desirable
Making
territory.
Senator McDonald very happy.
In terms of the density that the population serves. So I hope that we'll lean into it a little bit and try to help this happen, as opposed to get caught up on foregone revenue and then have no one else step up to go into the territory.
Yeah, I think we would like to do this, but I think we also need to know that in doing this,
right,
what are the potential risks?
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. So Maria,
Okay.
walk us through. Tell us what we can't do.
Okay.
We'd love to hear that.
Okay, I know you do. And this is going to be extraordinary because of the amount of information that's in here. But I hear you
34.
that you don't want to get into the weeds. It's hard not to get into the weeds when it comes to broadband regulation.
Yep.
But I fully appreciate that your wherewithal right now might not be there. However, you'll have this document and you can think about it, mull it over, and we can come back and revisit any aspect of it that you'd like to. So this was actually a presentation that I had done in a House committee earlier this session, which related to the Communications Act of 1934, which is the federal law that controls communications policy generally. The plus is, because I kind of went beyond that to some other considerations, constitutional issues and things that will influence what a state can do, what kind of regulatory that the state has. So you're getting the presentation with all of the bells and whistles. But I'm going to go through this really quickly. But I think what's that? I can always come back.
Yeah,
yep.
We can always.
Yes. But I will tell you the intent is to kind of describe the regulatory framework, the legal framework primarily, and to highlight for you kind of what some of the key issues are that you should have on your radar about what may or may not change and what's ahead and what kind of the most contentious issues are and things that you'll think about as you decide where you want to go or not go. Okay, so this sounds like I'm really going back to 101, and I'm not going to stay here very long because I've already just said, the Communications Act controls communications policy nationally. The only thing I really wanted to highlight in terms of that goal of the FCC, what its mission is, because this is all relevant to states' authority, and that's the only reason why I'm going here. So you have this federal entity whose goal is to make available, so far as possible, to all the people of the United States, a rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. That's the mission of the FCC at the federal level. And the only reason why I'm pausing to talk a little bit about the leadership of the FCC, there are 5 commissioners. They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. The president selects the chair. Only 3 commissioners can be of the same political party. This is very similar to how other federal agencies are run, but I'm pausing a little bit here because there has been this kind of what people call policy ping pong in terms of different administrations having very different policies with respect to communications. So obviously a new administration now, the Biden administration, there are now currently 4 members. A 5th member has not been selected.
Everything okay?
So that's imminent, and that may very well. Yep. Was there a question?
I hear a question.
No, maybe not.
Okay, I can't see it.
Okay. So again, just to highlight, some changes may be on the horizon. And so when you look at the federal law, from its inception, there's always been this notion of dual sovereignty, dual federal state jurisdiction, with the FCC having jurisdiction over interstate communications and the states having jurisdiction over intrastate communications. I am going to jump really quickly ahead because I know we're going to be short for time, but you can see already that may have worked in 1934 really well, particularly because when you were talking about telephone service, where you had intrastate and long distance, and it was pretty discrete, not entirely, but pretty much so. When now you're dealing with broadband that has elements of both interstate and intrastate, that just raises a whole slew of complications. Not going to go through all of this. Happy to do it at another time. But basically what this is setting up, this description, some of the highlights is the rise of communications processing, communications networks, their development over the decades. At the same time, a decision to break up AT&T and begin the process of promoting competition and deregulating and integrating new technologies, new communication services into that competitive market. All of that kind of came to a head in 1996 with what's called the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This was when kind of the first major overhaul of the Communications Act. And, you'll hear it over and over again. This was really when at the national level, there was a policy of deregulation and promoting competition. And the idea was to lower prices, make available higher quality services, and really increase the rapid deployment of new technologies. Not going to go through all of these. These are just some of the major provisions of the Telecommunications Act, but all of them really have to do with pulling back regulations and opening up networks so that more competitors can participate. You'll see here, reference to universal service. At the federal level, you have your state universal service fund and your own programs, which are very similar, and some of the challenges and how those funds are funded, where the revenue comes from. So they're, again, just kind of highlighting things. I happen to put in there a reference to section 230 because that's been in the news so much about, the legal shield for social media, just kind of an outlier in the context of communications law, but wanted you to kind of start having that in your mind, or at least know where it is in federal law. And I see
Senator Bray has a question.
Okay. Yes.
Senator Bray. I think you're muted, Senator Bray.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to be a good doobie between and keep my mic off. The question is, so I always think of telephone services always having carried as a regulated monopoly the obligation to deliver service to everyone. How about in the history of other non-telephone, but telecommunications, like the internet, basically, has it ever had an obligation to provide universal service?
No, no. It's an interesting question. Let's see. Let me just. Well, no. I think if I go back maybe a little bit. So yeah, so the short answer is no. So you're talking about kind of the carrier of last resort responsibilities that telecom providers have, right? They have to, if somebody wants telephone service, they have to build out. And there's been a funding mechanism for that through various forms of high cost programs. So yes, that's firmly established. But with respect to broadband, from the beginning, it's been treated as, a new service that should not be constrained and heavily subjected to economic regulations and really be able to flourish unfettered. I think as it's become more essential in everybody's lives, there's now rethinking of whether there should be similar obligations and responsibilities, but they've never been applied to date. So I think, that is certainly something that people are grappling with now. And I'm going to actually touch on that a little bit more, kind of the trends in regulatory policy, but short answer is no, they've never been subjected to that kind of universal service responsibility.
Okay, thank you.
So, and so what is interesting, the early days, in the 80s and the 90s, when you think about the type of broadband or narrowband that was available, what's interesting, I think, about that is, you were talking about dial-up service. And so in order to access the internet, you made a telephone call. So that transmission line, the telephone line, was regulated. So you had that connection to your house, and then you placed a phone call. So in some ways, you had your access to the internet because you could make the phone call using the dial-up service. That really started to change, though, as the ability to converge the telephone and the IP, the internet protocols, it wasn't quite so easy to regulate or not regulate. And so this is really stepping back, just kind of level setting a little bit about, the development of high-speed internet. So we're moving now beyond dial-up. We're talking about an internet connection that's always on. We're talking about wired connections, whether they're DSL, coaxial cable, fiber optic, or a hybrid. We're talking about wireless services, and there has been tremendous advancement and changes in the wireless industry with respect to terrestrial wireless services. Those are the antenna and the towers that are basically on the earth, and the development of 5G technology. And then the growth more recently in satellite sphere with low Earth orbit satellites. All of that is it's related to a number of things, but there's a lot happening at the federal level with respect to spectrum policy and how much of the spectrum is available for wireless services and what the technologies are capable of. So I'm only kind of just putting it out there in the context of these are things that are developing and are certainly will be relevant to the market nationally, but also in Vermont, what services may be available. I am trying to do this quickly, and
you are doing a great job of that. So
okay, I know it's a lot. So please call me if you want to go over any of this in detail.
Yeah, this is just giving us.
This is an overview, and then you'll direct me. Yep. So two things I want to talk about. One is the definition of broadband, and one is the classification of broadband. Very different. So that the FCC defines broadband. It comes up with a definition. It changes over time. Right now, it defines broadband as any service that's capable of a minimum of 25.3. That's important because that's the metric that the FCC uses to decide who is served and who's not served and who is eligible for funding. The state can define broadband for purposes of its own programs, however the state wants. But that's basically what the FCC has decided is the minimum speed necessary in order to use, current applications and services. I will just note here, for those of you who are not aware, there is a state goal of achieving 100 megabits per second symmetrical service at all 911 locations. That's all residences and businesses by 2024. So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. A lot of words on this page, not going to go into the details. We just talked about the definition of broadband. How broadband is classified for regulatory purposes is crucial to what authority there is to regulate, particularly at the federal level. Whether it's an information service, which it is right now, or a telecommunication service, much like the phone service. And as you know, the phone service has been subjected to utility style regulation. That authority exists, even if it's not being imposed currently, because trying to promote competition, that authority is there. That authority for that utility style regulation does not exist for information services. So there is tremendous controversy and disagreement about how broadband should be classified. Just gonna move on, but understand that that's something that is being debated and may very well come up again under a new administration. And this slide just kind of goes through, for the most part, broadband has been considered an interstate service, an information service, not subject to state regulation. But that now is all a little bit up in the air. And I'm going to talk about that mostly in the context of the recent Mozilla case and what it held with respect to the FCC's attempt to preempt all state regulation, which was struck down. Because that's going to be really important, is what, the state's authority. Yeah.
I think I hear Sandra Pearson with a question.
Yeah, I think it's just worth noting that cell phone service has always also, as I understand it, been not regulatable other than tower locations, just because it's sort of the same universe, right?
Yeah, well, so cell phone service has, for broadband, is not regulated. It's similarly treated. But telephone service is considered a utility, but it is not subject to rate regulation or market entry. So there's very limited. Mostly the authority exists around kind of the terms of service, things like that. But as a telephone service, it's a utility, but it's clear that the states do not have very much authority. The data aspects of cellular networks, though, fall within the broader broadband sphere.
Thanks.
So why is there so much confusion? Why can you not get a yes or no answer when you ask what the state can and can't do? There's tremendous amount of ambiguity in the federal act, and Congress to date has not really clarified things. When you look at the factors and just consider what the relevant factors are in this industry, you're talking about technology that changes daily, really significant market trends. And all of these are, of course, interrelated. A lot of consolidation in the market, companies, branching out into different aspects of the industry, and then, of course, obviously the consumer demand. The way we use the internet now and what we use it for, particularly in a pandemic, you can see that there's just so much that changes and has changed. But again, Congress has not really acted since 1996. And as I mentioned before, different administrations have different policies. Regulation, on the one hand, people think it should be a utility. Others absolutely disagree and think that you just leave the market, unregulated, and that is the best way of promoting innovation and competition. And because administrations have different policies, you've heard of probably Chevron deference, that the courts defer to what the agencies say and how they interpret ambiguous terms, so that every time there's a new administration, new FCC, if they have a different policy, it's likely that the courts are going to say, sure, that's reasonable. Now everything's going to change. I put a for now in parens there just because that's a kind of an issue out there about how much deference federal agencies should be given. And then, of course, a lot of compelling interests at stake, whether it's the financial interests of the companies or from the state's perspective, public health, safety, and welfare. The end result is there's a tremendous amount of litigation. But now we're going to focus in a little bit more on state's authority. What does the act say about the state's authority? And so that's why I want to go back to this preemption directive. So this was part of the FCC's 2018 order, which reclassified broadband as an information service. There was a brief period of time under the Obama administration where broadband was classified as a telecommunications service. And that was the basis of its net neutrality rules at the federal level. So more recently in 2018, again, a reclassification and an attempt to preempt all state laws. What was interesting about that, and I think noteworthy, is so even though the FCC said, look, we're going to preempt everything in really in a sweeping preemption, like broader than ERISA preemption, even though they said that to promote uniformity, they at the same time said that states continue to have a central role in policing such matters as fraud, taxation, general commercial dealings, remedying violations on a wide variety of general state laws, and enforcing fair business practices. So even at the same time the FCC itself issued this sweeping directive to preempt everything, it did recognize that there is still some room for the state. I think that's significant. Having said that, as I mentioned, the Mozilla court vacated that preemption directive, basically reaffirmed that there's dual federal state authority in this area, that there's room for intrastate broadband regulation. So where might that room be? What are some, provisions in the federal act that relate to state's jurisdiction? It has to do with collection of broadband data, state initiatives to improve broadband, protecting public safety and welfare, managing the rights of way, ensuring universal service. These are just broadly speaking some of the provisions and some of the areas where the states have some authority. There are a lot of nuances here, but that kind of just starts to frame, a little bit more granularly, where the authority might be. But there is still this remaining question. How do you have concurrent federal and state jurisdiction over a service that has both an interstate and an intrastate component? What you are left with is the impossibility exception and conflict preemption. I know this is a lot of information. So I'm just going to say, basically, if you tried to do something, the state tried to regulate broadband, you could be preempted if that preemption was necessary to protect a valid regulatory objective, such as promoting competition, and your regulation would negate the FCC's authority and its goals, basically. So that's how a court might look at something that you do. Also, is there a conflict? Does the state law, under the particular circumstances, present an obstacle to what Congress has intended to do? So when I say congressional intent, that's where I go back to the mission of the Communications Act. That's really where Congress spoke initially and has never changed in terms of what the mission of the FCC, building out a national network and reaffirming in 1996 that there is still state and federal jurisdiction. So no, there can be no broad preemption directive. But what there will be going forward is a very fact-intensive inquiry So that's why everyone's looking at California right now and whether their state law, which again is very broad, will be upheld in the courts. That's the Communications Act. That's how things are looked at in that context. You know, obviously anything else that you do, you know, there are some other provisions and sources of authority that will be relevant super generally under the 10th Amendment. So, you know, the state has its traditional police powers to act, to protect its consumers, to prevent unfair business practices or unfair competition. And that's really been something that's driven what you've done in the past, you know, looking at net neutrality, and you're trying to deal with the fact that there, in some places, at least in Vermont, there isn't competition. There's no consumer choice. So what can the state do to protect consumers? That's looked at within the 10th Amendment. Having said that, you know, making sure, you know, because it's an interstate commerce question, that what you do doesn't have the effect of regulating beyond your borders, right? This is the Dormant Commerce Clause. These are the things that come up, you know, and is the burden on commerce, is it going to be excessive compared to what you're trying to do? It's kind of a balancing. Broadly speaking, and this market participant doctrine, you know, so this is, you know, in part what you relied on under the states, other than the state's police powers. You know, if the state's giving out money, if the state is, you know, managing its own land, if the state is buying internet service, a government contract, there's tremendous amount of discretion in what it can do, because it's not acting as a regulator, it's acting like a consumer. And even under the federal FCC policies, you know, consumers have choice, and that's how they protect themselves. Well, the government, the state, you know, you can spend money on services, infrastructure that you feel is in the best interest of the state. That's not unlimited, you know, even, okay, obviously, the law that you pass, your net neutrality law, is very narrow, but nevertheless, you know, you're in litigation right now. So there's ample room for people to argue about what the effects are of any assertion of state authority. The other, just two things I was going to mention, and we're almost done. You know, so issues have come up about, can we require open access? Well, if you want to require a private company to open up its network, you're looking at taking private property basically for a public use. And you may be able to do that, but certainly not without compensation, right? So you can't just take private property, deprive it of its economic value without compensating the provider. There is an exception to that. You know, there's been discussion about, well, especially in light of the pandemic, right? The states have, and federal government have taken extraordinary measures to protect the public. Temporary takings, which is kind of what this category would fall into, you know, you have greater authority. And the reason is because what you're doing is not depriving a private entity of its economic investment, its interests. You might be minimizing value, you know, causing a diminution in value. But the assumption is that in time, the property will recover value as soon as the prohibition is lifted. So, you know, this is the issue that's kind of come up in terms of, can we have a moratorium that applies to broadband providers, right? So, you know, and this is also an interest, well, never mind, I'm going to move on. So, and then finally, kind of the other federal act, and I think Senator Cummings was alluding to this before, the Internet Tax Freedom Act, federal law that basically bars states from imposing taxes on internet access. So there's some gray area about what internet access is, but in general, you know, broadband service, from a consumer's perspective, You know, again, you can pay that universal service charge on your telephone bill, but you can't pay it on your broadband bill, and you don't pay it now. It applies to the sale and purchase of internet access service. It does not apply to fees imposed for a specific privilege, service, or benefit conferred. It also does not apply to dedicated 911 service fees and charges. So that's just kind of to put out there like the kind of the broad parameters of things to think about. And then here's kind of my list of what you should look at in any area of regulation of broadband. Is it competitively neutral? Is it non-discriminatory? Is it consistent with the FCC's goals of promoting competition? You know, you may end up promoting competition by investing or requiring more of broadband providers. Is it consistent with the state's police powers? The more compelling your interest is, the better. How burdensome is the regulation? The more tailored it is, the better. Is it technically feasible? You know, thinking of things like how easy is it to discriminate between intrastate and interstate traffic? Is it economically reasonable? What are the costs of compliance? And then really developing the record to support this, because these are things that a court would look at and are frankly relevant. Lastly, this is all subject to change. And what I mean by that is the litigation is ongoing. As I mentioned before, the Biden administration may have very different policies, which will impact what you do. So I am so sorry to throw all of that at you.
Breath.
But I think we've covered the highlights. So I will stop my share as soon as I can get up there.
Actually, I think this was very helpful.
Okay.
Gives us a
Great.
quick walkthrough. I assume we've got your slides somewhere,
Yes.
probably online, so we can go refer to it when we need to. Senator Sirotkin, you have a question?
Thank you, Maria. That was great. So you said that we're in litigation, but it's been on hold for years. Now we're dependent on the California case, which you describe the law as being very broad. If California's law was narrow and ours was broad, as opposed to vice versa, then I could see the reason to hold off. But I guess what I'm saying, if the government of California loses their case because our law is so much narrower, wouldn't our law not likely be fully impacted by the California decision?
I think that's a good point. I think that's possible. If California loses, so their law is struck down, you may still be subject to litigation, because then the providers might say, well, and Vermont, even though it's a very narrow proposal, we still think it's preempted. So the litigation may go forward. If the California law is upheld, it's likely the Vermont lawsuit would be dismissed. Likely, I say that likely because who knows, and they're different jurisdictions. California, what happens in California is not controlling for Vermont. But really, you know, that you may want to talk to the Attorney General about kind of the thinking and what the expectations are and why the litigation was put on hold. I think that decision was made in September of last year, 2020.
And the other question I have is related. When we passed that law, I remember being on finance, and the broadband companies came in and said, you don't need to pass this law because we never would violate internet neutrality. They even put ads out in the New York Times about how important net neutrality was. Are you aware of any indication either here or anywhere in the country where they started to charge people different amounts for different speeds and things like that?
Paid prioritization. honestly, I haven't heard anything in Vermont. I'd have to look. I just have to look, and I will do that.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Brock, you had a question? No, okay. Thank you, Abby. Senator McDonald.
I was fascinated with the presentation, and particularly with the example of the build out of telephone service in the United States. What was the rationale once telephone service had been built out everywhere that the court used to say enough is enough? You've got to do open access. Ma Bell has to provide open access. What was the rationale for open access at that point?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So that actually started in part, there were a couple of things going on. There were some lawsuits going on. And the earlier ones, like in the 60s, all of it had to do with competition and antitrust, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
the cases in the 60s had to do with the phone company was requiring consumers to purchase their products, right? And so consumers or different companies wanted to sell, their products, their phones, or, I don't remember the details, but so there was a concern that they were not being permitted to do that because the phone company was saying, you have to buy our product, and basically putting other businesses out of business. So that resulted in litigation, which resulted in what's called customer premises equipment, the CPE exemption, where that no longer can be part of the telephone company's requirement that you purchase their products. That was one thing where the unbundling started to happen within the industry. Then you had the Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit, commenced a lawsuit in the 1970s, which finally resulted in a consent decree in 1984, and just found that the monopoly had grown so big and that there were harms to the consumer, potential harms. There was no real sufficient way of regulating and protecting consumers. So that broke up, that divested. Yeah.
Madam Chair, can I interrupt? Because that is the point where the philosophy of that we're going to grant the monopoly, we're going to leave them unregulated, and they're going to build out, and everyone will be well served. And when it got to the point where that was not working anymore, is that not when Ma Bell got broken up, and all of a sudden things flourished once again, and there was build out and reduced rates? Is that the fulcrum point right there?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, I think that's, I'm certainly not an expert, but I think you're right. You're describing kind of the process that happened. At the same time, you had these new technologies developing, right? So there was an awareness that you have new communications technologies coming onto the market. You have cell phone service coming into the market, right? So all of that
stifled up until that point.
And I think that was the point in 1996, when they said, let's really open up the networks and allow these competitors in.
So, Madam Chair,
Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Maria, for doing that last chapter in that saga. And I submit, and this is totally editorial, Madam Chair, I think when it comes to broadband, we have reached that point now where the private sector has gone as far as it's going to go, and we need to do something, because the private sector is going back to Montpelier, for example, to replace 12.3. And meanwhile, out in the countryside, they won't do anything. And even when they do it with tax dollars, when they're given tax dollars to build it out, they won't provide open access. And I vision ourselves here in Vermont today at that same point we were when Ma Bell had done all it could do, and it was time for something new. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Abby. Commissioner Bolio is with us, at least I see.
You mean, thank you,
There
Maria.
he is. So thank you, Maria. And you've given us a lot to think about this weekend. And Commissioner Bolio, thank you for being available. I'm, seeing the emails flowing back and forth, then got one that said this is going on, probably on the budget adjustment, and just thought as the tax committee, we should know what it is. So if you can let us know, and Senator Sirotkin.
Can I just do a brief setup on this? Because we
Sure.
actually passed out this bill out of our committee this morning on a committee bill. We took about 45 minutes of testimony, and I'll give you the short version. When we were dealing with 1099s, we offered up to the Department of Labor asking what we could do to help move this along. And I suggested, is there any legislative changes we could make? They came back to us yesterday and said, yeah, you can give us some access to confidential documents that are confidential with the tax department right now. So we worked with Damian Leonard, drafted a bill, worked with the administration and the tax department, and brought everybody in this morning. We took testimony and we voted the bill out, and it should be introduced as a committee bill on Tuesday. At the time we did that, the deputy chief of civil affairs said there was some talk about putting it on the budget bill or the Budget Adjustment Act.
Yeah.
And then we said, fine, we'll make our decision on this, put it out. And if the powers that be want to use that as a vehicle, fine. I'm pretty sure it'll be the exact same bill. And what it does is just allows cross-checking of the information that tax has computerized better than the Department of Labor, so that can get out these new 1099s quicker and put everybody at ease quicker. And we check with the ACLU and with the Attorney General, and everybody's fine with it. It's a time limited thing. It only goes until July 1st. That's the bill.
So, Commissioner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner. Senator Sirotkin just stole all my thunder. That was a great summary of the issue and the bill that we're asking for. I guess just a couple of points that I would add. It's going to be one toolkit or one tool in a toolkit that the Department of Labor is going to be using, so it won't be the end all be all. And really the last bits that we're talking about here, right? The tax has already done an aggregated match at the request of the Department of Labor. So the Department of Labor sent the tax department a full 1099 or multiple files, because they have multiple programs, for their 1099-Gs, and we matched them against tax records, names, and socials that we had in our database. And we were allowed under existing law to provide an aggregated hit rate, but we're not allowed to provide the detailed records that either matched or didn't match. So what this bill does is allow us to provide the detailed records.
Okay.
Logistically, what we would be talking about releasing, it'd be a limited scope of release of tax information, because it would only be those that didn't match that we would release the info on, and we would be releasing the names that we have in our database for the social security numbers that Department of Labor sent to us that had a different name attached to it. And many of the issues that they're trying to resolve at this point, right, are the ones where it could even be a typographical error from the claimant, right? If their real social begins with 008, maybe they typed 080 when they first set up their claim. The downstream impact of that, they can still file their tax return, and the Department of Labor can still send us that 1099-G file. And that claimant would still get their tax refund if they're owed one, but it would delay it, right? Because we wouldn't be able to do the same level of automated checks that we would normally do at the tax department. So this is not a service that we normally do for other agencies or businesses, but given the volume and the challenges that this audience has already faced, we felt that this was a worthwhile next step.
Okay. So right now, they can send you a list and you can go through it and you can say to them, well, you missed on 10 out of 100, but we can't tell you what 10.
That's right.
And this would allow you to say, these 10 don't match.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is what the correct match should be. Or this
I
is
don't
what
know
you
that-
need to correct it to, probably.
I'd want to be careful making that statement. I don't think that the tax department would, but it would just say it doesn't match, right? I think the point then would be takes more research. There's a chance that our data is incorrect, right?
Right.
But I do think it's more likely that our data is correct, but it would require further review for the Department of Labor. And again, they should have multiple sources. I'm sorry, I'm not privy to all of the different steps that they're taking, but they'll have a number of different sources to try to help triangulate this.
Okay. Any questions, committee? Wow. Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. You got off easy today. No, yeah, I spoke too soon. I've got Senator Bray and then Senator Hardy.
Had to curse me, Madam Chair.
I know.
Well, this one is, I was waiting till the last minute because it's not directly on this issue, but I'm wondering for some research we're doing in my other committee, if it is not hard for you to do, if you can produce a list of a grand value list, not every property, for the whole state. Like, it's like a grand list of grand lists, just looking for approximate. And I don't know if that's, easily done because we can just sum the columns differently, or you go, no, actually, we don't have anything like that. In which case we'll say, thanks, don't worry about it.
I want to make sure I'm understanding the ask, Senator. Are you saying what's the total property value across the state for all
Yes.
parcels?
Yep.
Yeah, I think we can get that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you get the yield.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Hardy.
I'd be happy to follow up on that. Let me take a quick note.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just looking at the language in the bill. That's why I was hesitating about asking a question. I just wanted to make sure I understood what was going on. But I guess maybe this goes without saying, but I'm assuming what you're doing is okay with federal law, because I know that that's an issue with sharing private information when it's related to social security numbers and the like. So I'm assuming that this is all kosher with federal law, but just wanted to ask that for the record.
Yeah, that's a great question, Senator. There are different sets of rules for federal tax information. And so, yes, we will have to be mindful of that. If any of the information that we would send is coming from federal tax information, that would have different requirements. Frankly, without looking at the details of the file, there should be a low percentage chance of that. And that would frankly be ideal because then we just don't have to worry about those additional requirements.
Okay. And then a follow-up question, would this expedite in any way? I mean, obviously would help expedite cleaning up this mess, whatever term you want to use for it. But would it also expedite their filing of state income taxes, or does it stop there? It would. So they would make it.
Yeah. So one of the things that we do, right, is we match information that we receive from taxpayers with information that we receive from businesses if they have W-2s, or from agencies if they have 1099-Gs. So in cases where the social security number that is on the Department of Labor's 1099 doesn't match with what's in the Department of Tax's records, that very well may delay a tax refund for that individual, because it would require somebody in my office to go look through the records and try to find that match manually.
Okay. And one final question, I'm not letting you off easy, is that what is going to happen with taxpayers, people who receive these incorrect 1099s, that they don't actually know they're incorrect at this point? I was saying to the Commissioner of Labor that, when I get my 1099s and W-2s or whatever, I stick them in a folder and look at them later when I do my taxes. So there are maybe many people out there who haven't even looked to see that things are wrong. They're just sticking them in a folder somewhere. So how, is that built into this assumption of how this is being handled?
I'd want to pose that question to the Department of Labor, but let me take a stab from my chair at the tax department, right? I mean, one, I think the best outcome is that people don't file their taxes until they know that they have the correct document. So to the degree that some share of taxpayers are just setting them aside and waiting to get the corrected record, I'm fine with that for my chair, because they'll get a new one in the mail hopefully quite soon, and that one will be correct, and they can send the other one back. In cases where somebody either inadvertently filed or they didn't know that they had the wrong info and they choose to file anyway, there could be complications down the line from that, right? The first would be that maybe they recognize they used the incorrect info when they get the new correction. Guidance that we're either already is on our website or will be on our website soon is to contact us if that happens. If it's a small enough change or a small enough discrepancy, we may be able to simply make the adjustment on our side, and the taxpayer would get an adjustment notice and then would get either an increased or a reduced refund depending on the real values. If it's a substantial difference or there are some other complicating factors, it might require amended returns. And in the cases where somebody files with the incorrect information and never recognizes it, we either may catch it on the front end when we go through to review, and in which case they would get an adjustment notice and a change to their refund without prompting from them. Or the worst outcome that I see, but also the least likely that I see, is it could be flagged by one of our future discovery programs, right? When we get additional information from the IRS. And that usually happens 18 to 24 months after a filing due date, where we have a discrepancy between what was filed at the state level and the federal level. Those turn into audit programs for us. And again, my hope would be that there would be a very low number or zero from this issue, but that would be the final backstop.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'm assuming, maybe I shouldn't assume, but that we would be holding taxpayers harmless if they are delayed and or these negative outcomes happen, or how are you handling that if people are filing late or filing incorrectly because of having the incorrect forms?
Well, most of this should be cleaned up before the due date. So I think that there's very little chance of penalty and interest being associated, right? So the filing due date isn't even for 2 months from this point. I think the biggest risk right now is that many folks would like to access their refund as soon as possible. So I think that's where the time pressure comes at this point. I would never want to say that there would never be penalty and interest on this, because in a case where somebody looks at the document and then says, boy, this is a lower number than it should be, I'm going to file with this, right? Like then you're talking about the potential for fraud. And I wouldn't want to say that somebody like that would be held harmless, but certainly my office is not looking to kick people when they're down if they have been harmed by this issue.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Senator Saratin, you have
One very quick question, because we raised this in our committee like about 10 days ago, and I sort of got an answer, but I never followed up on it for sure. Will the new 1099-Gs have the word corrected on them?
I don't know the answer to that, Senator. I'm not privy to the new process that DOL is doing for that. I apologize.
I've seen corrected on a lot of 1099s personally. Is that not a normal thing for businesses and government agencies to put on the?
It can be. My understanding, again, and it may be multiple things that they're doing, but DOL, I do know, is trying to bring attention to the fact that there is another one going out. I don't know the exact steps that they're taking.
Well, I'm just wondering if they get another one and then they're sitting with two of them, they might not know which one's the correct one if it's not clear. Isn't that something you would like to see? Can't you in-house and government come up with that decision?
Yeah, I'll follow up on that, Senator.
Thank you.
okay. Thank you, Commissioner. Now we know what we may be voting on. And thank you, committee. I think it's been productive afternoon. I know we've gotten an awful lot of information in a short time. So have a good weekend. We'll see everybody on Tuesday.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Stay warm.